This episode is sponsored by Zatch Bell.
Hey, his scoop's bigger.
Welcome back to the courtroom, Hebrews and Shebrews. It's so nice to see you. I hope you've been well since our last case, where I defended poor Bobby Hill against the charges of degeneracy and lewd conduct. Doesn't that seem like a lifetime ago? It practically was. My goodness, I'm an entirely different and better person since then, and I hope you are too. Well, today we have to discuss yet another lovable and rambunctious youngster, one who has been unfortunately maligned by the community at large. He has been called a punk, a hoodlum, and in some particularly well-read circles, even a ne'er-do-well. But where some might see a troublemaking youth, I see a creative, a scholar of the arts, and a master of music. I am of course referring to my defendant, Mr. Kane Skretteburg.
3 down and 1 to go.
But before we examine my client, let us first start by taking a look at the actual aggressive party, Mr. Hank Hill and his gang of tunnel snakes, who I am legally obligated to say rule. The day in question began with our local chemical dealer, Mr. Hank Hill, attempting to fix his associate's miniature tornado machine, which I'm told harms our environment with its gasoline engine. After making the following cutting xenophobic remark,
"Well, that's what you get for buying a Japanese leaf blower. It's built for blowing those little bonsai bushes and cherry blossoms."
the Hank Hill crew were confronted by a concerned citizen who gently asked them to find an alternative method of transporting the leaves that were already in an orderly pile.
What the hell's wrong with using a rake? You lazy punks!
This man is voiced by one of the greatest and most prolific voice actors of any age, Mr. Jim Cummings, who is perhaps best known for his role as the Captain of the Guard in Shrek. Oh, and also he voiced some nobodies that are named Pete, Fuzzy Lumpkins, Lord Boxman, and at one point in his career, Zummy Gummy? Okay. Hank Hill and his bussy boys put no respect on Mr. Cummings' name and doubled down by mocking one of our nation's most famous and most unwatched melodramas.
Keep watching Touched by an Angel.
After the opening, we learn that Bobby apparently got chickenpox at the Little Junior Plus fashion show and seems to have come out of this whole ordeal better than ever.
The doctor says getting chicken pox at the age of 12 could cause sterility in weaker children.
As part of their dying wish, Bobby and Joseph begged their parents, please to take them to the Family Fun Center, but this request is quickly put on the back burner as a faint noise begins emanating from the distance.
That noise has been giving Nancy headaches all week. Then yesterday, her back broke out in scratch marks.
Oh, come now, you see, the music couldn't have been that disruptive. Ecstasy back scratches don't just happen to any background noise. Don't believe me? Well, try going ham on some cheeks with some Norwegian death metal going on and see how that works out. Note, Mr. Tedef is not responsible for any injuries, pregnancies, or infidelities that may occur during your sexual activities. Please do not touch, fondle, or be near any human being for any length of time, ever. Unable to let well enough alone, Hank decides to confront Mr. Skretteburg, who was practicing his music on his own property during daylight hours. When Mr. Skittlepop responded with a gentle and warm greeting, Mr. Hill then made some veiled threats about burning down Mr. Skunktastic's domicile.
Oh my lord. You've got 5 plugs and 1 outlet here.
On top of this, when the boys decided to lower the tension in the room with a bit of audio editing, Mr. Hill then attempted to escalate by causing emotional distress to my client by reminding him of his dead family.
Don't like music.
I don't like music.
Hey, now cut that out. Does your father know you're doing this?
My dad's dead.
Does your mother know you're doing this?
My mom's dead.
Realizing that this conversation with Mr. Hill wouldn't lead to anything productive, Kane and the boys attempted to make Bobby laugh, first by making Hank's comments seem funnier than they actually were, and then by incorporating the name of the upcoming destination into their song. In a blind rage, Hank attempted to save face by taking his family and friends to the fun center, but in this privately acquired footage, labeled Exhibit 69, this will show the depravity of Mr. Hill's inner thoughts.
Let's see, they give you kids guns and let you shoot at each other? Yeah, okay.
Sending his son off to do some unsupervised shooting, Mr. Hill and his cohort of degenerates then exhibit some antisocial behavior by intentionally striking the golf ball collector. This was when Bobby and Joseph returned to the care of their neglectful parents and made the following claim against my client.
These older guys cornered us in a hole, and they kept firing and firing. They made us eat leaves.
Now, while this may seem initially awful and the prosecution has attempted to smear my clients with this testimony, let us remember that earlier in the day that both of the boys were collapsing from the fallout of chickenpox. Mr. Skretteburg obviously saw this, paused the game, and attempted to get the boys some food as they looked quite malnourished and 2 doors down from death. Now I ask you, is Mr. Skretteburg a nutritionist? No. He simply assumed, much like many countless Boy Scouts before him, that nature's bounty is the ultimate ambrosia and a way of warding off the chilly hands of the Reaper. To put on the act of being a good parent, Mr. Hill then confronted my client who was attempting to make friends with Miss Platter. In spite of Mr. Hill's aggressive stance, Mr. Skretteburg kept his cool and delivered what I believe the kids would call an epic burn.
I spent 4 years holding guys like you upside down over toilets.
I don't care how many guys you held in the men's room.
May I please motion to have my client recognized as a goddamn legend? Not to be deterred by Mr. Skretterbunion's wit or status as one of the only players to never have been shot during a paintball match, Mr. Hill then rallied his troops.
What do you say? You want to teach some punks little respect?
Oh, yeah.
Very little.
Unfortunately, Mr. Hill's tactics were a sorry display. Instead of branching out and trying to get into one-on-one encounters, the Rainy Street 4 stayed bunched up, making themselves easy pickings, especially given the sorry state of Mr. Dotreve's pants.
Hey, they're over here! I heard the bald guy split his pants!
This was when, in an effort to deter any further harassment by Mr. Hill or his peers, my client then marched the Four Stooges to the driving range and proceeded to do what is technically called a showing of force.
Wait a minute, you can't just execute my men.
Later, Pops.
And please, what is more American than making a painful example of a tyrannical bully? Mr. Skretteburger time was simply following in the footsteps of the soldiers of the American Revolution. Through guerrilla tactics, which is infinitely superior to squirrel tactics, Mr. Hill, or as he's known to his close friends, King George III, was defeated by the rebellious spirit of a true patriot. Following this unfortunate event, Mr. Mr. Hill, began supposedly showing signs of PTSD.
Sure is cold, all right. Maybe I should have brought mittens.
Instead of wearing their welts and bruises as badges of honorable combat, they began to fight amongst themselves, with Mr. Hill being the chief offender. He calls out the quality of their beer, asks who bought this stuff, and calls Bill a moocher when the man simply responds in the negative. He is so blinded by his hurt pride that Mr. Hill then delivered this scalding insult to, supposedly, his best friend.
Stop it, stop it, stop it. I can't stand fighting.
Yeah, we know that. You showed that on the paintball field.
I am not a coward.
And before I continue, I must say my sympathy does go out to Mr. Dotreve and Mr. Gribble. First for aligning themselves with such a terrible bully, but second for Mr. Dotreve not being able to afford a second shirt and being forced to wear the one that was stained by the paintballs. After this trial, I will be petitioning the army to increase the pay for military barbers, as Mr. Dotreve should not be forced to live in such squalor. It is an insult to our armed forces and to anybody who has ever gotten a haircut. But Mr. Hill's blindness to his friend's strife isn't the only kind he possesses. In a much more literal sense, he cannot even see when his wife is giving him an expression that would be perfectly at home in the Berenstain Bears books.
Hank, I am giving you a look.
Now this is where I must address the primary argument of the prosecution, which is Mr. Hill's supposed trauma. Supposedly, after seeing Mrs. Hill's painted nails, Mr. Hill became triggered and underwent what could only be described as a frantic hallucination. In this dream state, Mr. Skretteburg and his friends become giant figures, dealers of painted death, all while demonic versions of the golfers and Bobby watch on and laugh. and laugh and laugh.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that? What is that, Private Pile?
And I will admit, this impressive smear campaign against Kane is very well animated and does have a rather rockin' soundtrack, but this is nothing more than an unfair demonization of the actual events. Mr. Hill and his team could make losing a game of Monopoly look like Pearl Harbor, but it wouldn't make that winner a bad person. This is simply the bad attitude of someone who could not handle what certain stylish fetuses call a massive L. And just to show that I am not downplaying actual trauma, let me prove that Hank was not in fact traumatized, because let us see what happens moments after this supposed freakout.
Hank Hill can do anything he puts his mind to.
Anything?
But even worse than this is that their lovemaking was so loud, so intense, so feverish, that Bobby even mistakes it for a couple of big ol' raccoons running around the house. How insane is that? Does your lust know no bounds, Mr. Hill? My God!
Dad, the raccoons are back!
The next day, full of pep and empty of spunk, Mr. Hill then decided to make the worst mistake of his life and attempted to get a rematch with Mr. Skretteburg. And this was obviously an awful idea, as Mr. Gribble himself was quick to point out.
Rematch? I thought we agreed never to discuss the horrors that we saw on the killing fields of the Fun Center.
But because Mr. Hill decided to make this matter into one of identity, he is then able to get the rest of his friends on board. This is no longer just about losing an innocent game, this is about whether or not Mr. Hill and his friends are getting older and are losing touch with their more youthful side. In effect, they do not want to become like Mr. Jim Cummings, who they viciously mocked earlier. And let me make it clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong or undesirable about being old. If you are lucky enough to reach 70, 80, 90 years old, then you are not only the envy of the dead, but also every unfertilized sperm. Mr. Hill was not content with his family, his life, or even the respect of his friends, and therefore he decided to cling on to his youth with both hands, even if it hurt others. Full of adrenaline, Mr. Hill headed to Mr. Skretteburg's estate, accessed their breaker box, and silenced their instruments, forcing a confrontation.
Rematch, tomorrow, noon. If you got any guts, you'll be there.
He was so desperate for this rematch that he even fixed Mr. Skretteburg's car just to ensure that the violence continued. And brilliantly, Mr. Skeet Skeetberg and his crew absolutely decimated this attempt at revenge.
Well, at least this time one of us got a shot off.
Sorry, Bill.
But because the door was now open to unprovoked rematches and violence, Mr. Skretterbump decided that after 2 initial strikes by Mr. Hill, it was time to bring down the hammer and make sure the harassment was over for good.
Somebody needs a touch-up.
And generously, Mr. Steakberg taught them this lesson without having to get everyone down to the Fun Center and pay money for those services, which means that this could technically qualify as a pro bono exhibition, which I would call generous beyond belief and may even qualify for a tax write-off. But at this point, the gears in Mr. Hill's mind once again began to turn towards violence. This is when he said, quote, "If we don't want to end up helpless and feeble like Pops, we have to do what he never did, understand the mind of a teenager."
Who's Pops?
This is when the Legion of Doom went out into the unsuspecting world, gathering information that could be used in psychological warfare during a simple gentleman's game of paintball. I'll spare you the exact details of how this information was collected, but it involves such crimes as espionage on a US Army base,
teenagers can be so cruel. Okay, Pimples, hop on up.
stalking,
Oh, stuck boy. We need some sugar in aisle 3.
and the mishandling of toxic chemicals in a public place.
Hey, jerkwad, you sprayed poison on my veggie wrap.
Yepper.
Once the Hill Consortium felt confident, they once again returned to the Fun Center and found Mr. Skretteburg and his friends there. Do you think they just happened to meet up like that? No, he orchestrated it. Hank Hill. You think this is something? You think this is bad? This chicanery? He's done worse. Just wait till you see what he does to the Megalomart. He moons the governor of Texas, and I went to bat for him. And I shouldn't have. I took him into my own channel. What was I thinking? He'll never change. Ever since he was a little boy, always the same, pushing over his mom's mailbox, disappointing his father with his crappy shooting skills. Oh, but not our little Hanky. Couldn't be precious Hank, ruining his parents' marriage. This hateable baby. And he gets to be a propane salesman? What a sick joke. But I'll stop him. I can prove he deserves to be behind bars. Him and his little friends.
Hey, Pops! How did you know to find us here?
Well, it's a school day, isn't it?
No longer content to just battle for honor, the stakes are raised, with Hank wagering Bill's broken leaf blower against Kane's amp, the thing that allows him to make an honest living. And I will remind the jury that contracts involving minors are not recognized without the consent of their guardians, which means that this whole final battle is null and void. When the battle begins, the Hill crew begin using every underhanded trick in the book. These tactics were supposed to reveal the flaws in the teens, but instead only served to show how low Mr. Hill was willing to go for this minor W. They sacrificed a member of their own team to draw out the boys, which is something that I would expect of Mr. Griffith, and make use of stolen property in the form of Mrs. Platter's answering machine.
Leave a message after the beep.
Beep. Beep.
Thankfully, Kane was too smart for these kind of strategies, and I think it behooves the court to remember just how world-wise and keenly sharp my client truly is.
3 down and... One to go.
In the ultimate showing of cowardice, Mr. Hill then disguised himself as an honorable working man, the golf ball collector, and used this opportunity to get in an easy, cheap shot. Although he did at least have the courtesy to add in this final epic farewell to Kane.
You lose.
Hey, his scoop's bigger.
As promised, Kane's band turned over the amp despite all of the cheating by the other team, which ruined their ability to practice. And just to take a very dangerous victory lap, a certain someone leaves a flaming bag on Kane's driveway and...
Good lord! That could start a fire!
Wait, is he really just using his shoes to stomp out the flames? He didn't contact the fire department or use an OSHA-approved fire extinguisher? Never mind, fuck this dork. Your honors, I motion to be dismissed from Mr. Stankbox's case on the grounds that he got poop on his J's, and if that isn't wrong, then I don't know what is. Oh yeah, great face there, Bill. You look like a taxidermied moose. So, now that I'm able to speak freely and without that interesting little sideways perspective on the episode, what are my true thoughts about Mr. Kane Skretteburg? Well, honestly, I think he deserves the chair. The electric chair, of course. No, worse than that. The fire chair. The fire poop chair, of course. But in all seriousness though, I think that Hank's initial provocation was a bit much. Going onto their property to complain and turning off the breaker box was, like, pretty inexcusable, but everything at the Fun Center was definitely born of Kane's cruelty and malice. And because I have yet to mention it thus far, I think it's pretty darn awesome that these guys are voiced by Green Day, and somehow it's even cooler that they gave the role of Kane to the drummer of the band, Trey Cool, rather than the lead singer. But even better than that, I think this episode stayed away from making the teens feel like totally flat stereotypes. Something about the way they audio mix the whole, like, I laugh at Tony Danza, or how Kane apologizes for not being able to make it to the first rematch because his, like, car broke down, that whole thing is, like, very human and very relatable. That is something I have always appreciated about King of the Hill, just how well it is able to write its teenage characters. They have this certain level of down-home chillness or coolness about them that just makes them really likable. It's almost like the show is casting actual teens who are happy to go along with the plot, but who really have their own stuff going on beyond the confines of King of the Hill. I don't really know how to articulate it, they just feel like, I don't know, just the right level of uninvested. That's part of the reason why I'm really looking forward to the eventual revival series of King of the Hill, as I think aging up Bobby to be like a high school kid or something could really open the door to all kinds of well-written scenarios. Mike Judge's teenage characters have always been treated more like mini adults, and I think that's where a lot of his strongest writing talents lie. Maybe that would make the show feel a little bit too much like Beavis and Butthead or Daria, but hey, if writing teenagers this well isn't broke, then don't fix it. But as for this episode specifically, it feels very aggressive, as many of the early episodes do. It doesn't really have a central message, it's just teaching some punks a lesson by shooting them. There is a deeper connection I could make to the amazing movie that this episode is named after, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, but I don't want to spoil that great western, and I would encourage everyone here to check it out. It is great. I love it. Watch it. It's one of the only movies that John Wayne is in where he's not like a big asshole. It is really good. It's called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Check it out. I love it. 2 big thumbs up. And as a final concluding thought, or rather a question about Kane, I have to ask, do you think that he and his little black parade ever went down to the caves? Because that's where we're going next time, where certain mysterious things can be found.
Check it out. It must have fallen off some woman.
But that's an unplanned pregnancy for another day. Until then, we can say that this episode, titled The Man Who Shot Kane Skretteburg, has indeed been reviewed to death. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.
That's my dad.